What happens when an African leader declares, "I will not be silenced," in front of Western officials? It's a sign that Western powers should stop trying to control Africa. It's over now. But what happened that led to this? And will they stop? Let's find out.
Please treat me with dignity the same way I am treating you with dignity.
Starting with, what compels a leader like Tulia Axon to advocate for dignity amidst the tumult of international diplomacy? Understanding her significance requires a closer look at her background and the larger context in which she operates. Axon hails from Tanzania, a nation rich in cultural diversity and historical complexity. Her rise to the presidency of the IPU symbolizes more than just a personal achievement. It represents a broader aspiration for African representation in global dialogues. Historically, African leaders have often been relegated to the sidelines in international discussions, their voices overshadowed by the louder proclamations of Western powers. Yet, as the landscape of global politics shifts, figures like Axon are stepping into the spotlight to challenge these entrenched narratives. Her leadership within the IPU provides a platform for African nations to assert their rights, push back against historical marginalization, and reclaim their agency. When Western representatives, particularly from Ukraine, questioned her engagement with Russian President Vladimir Putin, it was not merely a challenge to her authority, it was an affront to the dignity of African leadership itself. Axon's response, demanding respect and asserting her right to engage with whomever she chooses, was a powerful statement against the condescending attitudes that often permeate diplomatic discourse. This moment is pivotal. It's not just about Axon. It's about an entire continent declaring that its leaders will no longer be treated as mere pawns in a game dictated by others. By calling for dignity, Axon embodies the growing frustration among African leaders who are fed up with being viewed through a lens of stereotypes and biases. Her demand is a clarion call for recognition. Recognition that African leaders are equal players on the global stage, deserving of respect and autonomy. What exactly happened during the IPU meeting that prompted Axon to demand respect from her Western colleagues? The meeting itself was charged with tension, a microcosm of the larger geopolitical struggles at play. When Arur Gasimov, Ukraine's representative, insisted on a full protocol report regarding Axon's meeting with Putin, he unwittingly unleashed a torrent of disrespect that Axon would not tolerate. As Gasimov and other Western representatives interrupted Axon, attempting to assert their control over the narrative, it became clear that this was not just a debate about procedure, it was a clash of perspectives. Western nations, particularly in the context of the Ukraine crisis, seem to operate under the assumption that their narrative must be prioritized. This is where Axon's response became crucial. She firmly stated, "You have already spoken. You were given a chance to speak here. Give me time to address the governing council." Her insistence on having her voice heard was not merely a personal plea, it was a rejection of the dismissive attitudes that characterize so many interactions between African leaders and their Western counterparts.
Please, can you hold on? Thank you.
This interaction highlights a significant power dynamic in international relations. The tendency for Western nations to demand accountability from African leaders, while often ignoring their autonomy and the complexities of their diplomatic engagements. Axon's confrontation was a stark reminder that diplomacy is not a privilege bestowed by the West, but a right inherent to all nations, regardless of their geopolitical stature. Were the claims against Tulia Axon, that she exhibited bias toward Russia, valid? The short answer is no. Axon's interactions and statements during the recent IPU meeting reveal a commitment to impartiality and a broader diplomatic approach that challenges the narratives put forth by her critics. In her remarks during the IPU meeting, Axon made it clear that her commitment to dialogue transcends any single nation. She pointed out that her engagements are not limited to Russia. She has also met with leaders in conflict-ridden areas like Palestine and Israel. This approach illustrates her intention to treat all global conflicts with equal seriousness, reflecting a broader commitment to diplomacy rather than bias. By engaging with multiple stakeholders, Axon demonstrates her understanding of the interconnectedness of global issues, emphasizing that no conflict exists in isolation.
Is it was to begin with Ukraine. Ukraine responded the dates that we were ready to visit them. Mr. Zelensky and Mr. Speaker would be in New York for the NATO meeting.
Now the question is, how does Axon's demand for dignity reflect a broader transformation in African diplomacy? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. The repercussions of her confrontation with Western representatives extend far beyond a single meeting. They signal a potential paradigm shift in how African nations navigate the treacherous waters of global politics. Axon's assertiveness is indicative of a growing movement among African leaders to reclaim their narratives and assert their agency. With the upcoming BRICS summit on the horizon, the timing of Axon's remarks is critical. The BRICS coalition represents a counterweight to Western hegemony, emphasizing collaboration among nations that have historically been marginalized in global discussions. By standing firm against Western demands for compliance, Axon embodies a spirit of solidarity that resonates deeply within the broader African context. The message is clear. African nations will no longer be dictated to. They are ready to assert their interests on the world stage. Axon's stance also underscores a critical shift in diplomatic strategy among African leaders. No longer willing to operate under the shadow of Western influence, leaders are increasingly seeking to engage with nations like Russia and China, countries that offer alternatives to the Western-dominated narrative. This strategic pivot reflects a broader desire among African nations to diversify their partnerships and pursue policies that align with their national interests. Moreover, Axon's refusal to bow to pressure demonstrates a newfound confidence among African leaders. They are embracing their roles as equal players in global diplomacy, capable of making decisions that reflect their values and priorities. This confidence is not just a personal trait. It signifies a collective movement towards self-determination and empowerment across the continent. What does all this mean for IPU? The IPU was established to promote democratic governance and accountability among its member nations. Yet its effectiveness in truly representing African interests has been called into question. The recent events in Geneva underscore the urgent need for the IPU to evolve and adapt to the realities of contemporary diplomacy. For too long, the IPU has been perceived as a platform that reflects the power dynamics of global politics, often sidelining African concerns. The dominance of Western narratives and discussions has created an environment where African leaders feel compelled to justify their diplomatic choices rather than engage freely. This was evident during Axon's confrontation, where the interruptions from Western representatives highlighted a broader trend of condescension and disregard for African agency. However, the IPU has the potential to become a powerful platform for advocating African interests if it embraces a more inclusive approach. By prioritizing the voices of African leaders and facilitating genuine dialogue, the organization can help reshape the narrative surrounding African diplomacy. This requires a commitment to listening, valuing, and amplifying the contributions of African nations in discussions that affect their futures. The future of the IPU hinges on its ability to adapt to the changing dynamics of global diplomacy. The emergence of coalitions like BRICS signifies a shift toward a more multipolar world, where African nations are increasingly asserting their rights to engage with global powers on their terms. If the IPU is to remain relevant, it must recognize and embrace this shift, facilitating conversations that reflect the diverse interests of its members. Axon's call for dignity is more than a personal plea. It is a rallying cry for the entire continent. By demanding respect and asserting her right to engage in dialogue, she is not just defending her position, but advocating for a new standard of diplomacy, one that recognizes the agency and dignity of all leaders, regardless of their geographic origin. The IPU must rise to this challenge, ensuring that African voices are not merely heard, but valued in the international arena. So far, do Western officials know how to treat others with respect? Unfortunately, the evidence often points to a troubling reality. Many Western representatives struggle to extend the basic courtesy of respect to their African counterparts. This lack of respect goes beyond mere diplomatic faux pas. It reflects deeper systemic issues that continue to undermine the dignity of African nations in international relations. The patterns of condescension and disrespect displayed in diplomatic encounters illustrate a significant disconnect that must be addressed. To grasp the full picture, we must consider the historical context. For years, Western nations have positioned themselves as the global arbiters of morality and governance, frequently overlooking the rich complexities and unique histories of African countries. This attitude breeds a sense of superiority that often manifests in condescension during diplomatic engagements. For instance, during the 2018 G7 summit in Canada, a photograph of world leaders gathered around a table went viral, largely due to the dismissive posture of US President Donald Trump toward other leaders, including African representatives. The image highlighted a broader trend where Western officials, regardless of their intent, often fail to acknowledge the equal standing of their African counterparts. Such behavior is not just an isolated incident. It is part of a broader trend where Western officials often engage with African leaders with a sense of skepticism. Accusations aimed at Axon regarding her meetings with Vladimir Putin illustrate a dangerous assumption that African leaders must conform to Western narratives to be considered legitimate. This scrutiny undermines the agency of African nations and perpetuates a colonial mentality that assumes Western perspectives are inherently superior. For example, in 2022, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's Africa trip was criticized for prioritizing the U.S. narrative on democracy and governance without fully engaging with the local realities and perspectives of African leaders. Moreover, Western officials often fail to recognize the intricate historical and geopolitical realities that shape the decisions of African leaders. Figures like Axon navigate a complex landscape of relationships and conflicts, making choices that reflect the diverse needs and aspirations of their countries. For instance, when African leaders attend international summits, they often represent not only their nations, but also broader regional interests. Dismissing their agency not only disrespects their leadership, but also diminishes the potential for constructive collaboration on global issues, such as climate change, health crises, and economic development. Consider the case of former South African President Thabo Mbeki, who faced consistent challenges when trying to assert a unique African perspective on global issues. Despite his significant contributions to the dialogue surrounding HIV/AIDS, many Western leaders treated his insights with skepticism, often dismissing African approaches as less valid. This dismissive attitude not only undermined Mbeki's leadership, but also hindered progress on critical health initiatives across the continent. Yet, amid these challenges, many African leaders are rising to reclaim their dignity and assert their voices in international dialogues. Axon's powerful demand for respect during the IPU meeting resonated far beyond that single gathering. It was a clarion call for a new era of diplomacy that prioritizes equality and understanding over condescension. Her insistence that all nations deserve equal treatment is a pivotal reminder that respect in diplomacy is not a privilege, but a right. While some Western officials may strive for respectful engagement, the inconsistency between their rhetoric and actions reveals a persistent gap in understanding. The gap is often characterized by a failure to engage meaningfully with African perspectives and a tendency to view diplomatic relationships through a transactional lens rather than one of mutual respect and partnership. Bridging this gap is crucial for fostering genuine partnerships that can address pressing global challenges. The world is becoming increasingly interconnected, and it is imperative that all nations, particularly those from Africa, are treated with the dignity they deserve. Only through a shift in mindset and approach can we hope to build a more equitable and respectful international community, one where the voices of African leaders are valued and their contributions recognized as essential to the global dialogue. What can officials do to not be disrespected? Axon's demand for dignity is a crucial step in this journey, but it must be accompanied by a broader, more cohesive strategy that enables African nations to assert their interests confidently. One critical strategy involves fostering intra-African cooperation. By strengthening ties among African nations, leaders can present a united front that amplifies their collective voice in international forums. This solidarity is essential for challenging the narrative that African nations are fragmented and incapable of presenting a cohesive diplomatic strategy. initiatives like the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, can serve as a model for economic cooperation that strengthens diplomatic ties and enhances collective bargaining power. Moreover, African leaders must prioritize education and awareness raising around the importance of their engagements. The perception that leaders like Axon need to justify their diplomatic choices often stems from a lack of understanding of Africa's complex geopolitical landscape. By actively promoting narratives that highlight the continent's diverse realities, leaders can shift the conversation from one of suspicion and scrutiny to one of mutual respect and understanding. Additionally, African nations should continue to diversify their diplomatic partnerships. Engaging with non-Western powers like China, Russia, and India allows African leaders to explore alternative avenues for collaboration that align more closely with their national interests. This strategic pivot not only broadens their options, but also diminishes the monopoly that Western powers have historically held over African diplomatic engagements. Finally, there must be a concerted effort to reclaim the narrative surrounding African leadership in global politics. Axon's confrontation with Western representatives is a powerful example of how leaders can challenge preconceived notions about African agency. By standing firm in the face of disrespect, she sets a precedent for future leaders to follow. This shift in narrative is not just about individual leaders, but about an entire generation of African politicians ready to assert their rights, challenge stereotypes, and redefine what it means to be a leader on the global stage. Will there be a change after confronting them like Tulia Axon did? While Axon's bold demand for respect signifies a powerful stand against condescension and bias, the reality suggests that systemic changes in attitudes and behaviors may not come swiftly or easily. Despite the impact of Axon's confrontation, the entrenched patterns of disrespect and condescension towards African leaders are deeply rooted in historical and structural dynamics. For decades, Western nations have maintained a dominant narrative in international relations, often sidelining African perspectives. This systemic bias is not easily dismantled by a single confrontation or a moment of assertiveness. Many observers are skeptical about the likelihood of immediate change. The underlying power dynamics remain unchanged, and unless there is a concerted effort to challenge these structures, the status quo may persist. For example, instances of African leaders being interrupted or dismissed in international forums continue to occur even after moments of confrontation. The lack of substantive follow-up from Western nations often indicates a reluctance to fully embrace the principles of mutual respect and equality in diplomacy. While Axon's assertiveness is undoubtedly a step in the right direction, history shows that confrontations often lead to short-term recognition without lasting change. For instance, previous confrontations by African leaders, such as South African President Cyril Ramaphosa's criticisms of Western attitudes toward African sovereignty, garnered attention, but did not fundamentally alter how African leaders are perceived or treated. The persistent skepticism and scrutiny directed at African diplomacy reveal a reluctance among some Western officials to genuinely acknowledge the agency and complexity of African nations. Furthermore, the responses from Western officials can sometimes reflect a defensive posture rather than a willingness to engage constructively. Instead of acknowledging the validity of Axon's points, some may interpret her confrontation as a challenge to their authority, prompting a defensive reaction rather than an open dialogue. This dynamic can stifle genuine progress and reinforce existing barriers to respectful engagement. Do you think West and Western officials can change? How do they respect Africans? Let us know in the comment section. Should Africans teach the West a lesson? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.